Hi there everyone. Do hope you're well and managing to continue to cope with all the changes that are going on around us. And I want to welcome you to this next, I think it's the fourth part of a series of little videos that we're putting out on the theme of joyful in isolation. And we are currently, I believe, in about day 13 since our Prime Minister announced the lockdown here in the UK. And I'm sure that these abrupt changes are beginning to really sink in for many of you, and we all cope with change in very different ways. But there's a very attested cycle that psychologists have come up with that helps us understand some of the phases we go through as we cope with very abrupt change and crisis and even trauma. I wonder if you've heard of the Kubler-Ross cycle. It's the process we go through over time in response to that, and it begins of course with shock, and then denial. That can take many forms. We can minimize what's happened in some unhelpful ways. We can absorb ourselves in other things in order to avoid thinking about the reality of our new situation. That then can lead to frustration, anger, expressions of anger as we realise that we've lost control of a situation, and then through to experiment, which is where we begin to kind of find our feet in new ways and try out new routines, which then itself might lead through to decision, where we put new things in place in our lives, and eventually through to integration as we adjust and settle into a new normal. I wonder where you are within that cycle, and we can dip in and out of each of those phases, I think. Well, alongside the very real crisis that's unfolding all around us, of course, we find ourselves, don't we, in a period of enforced isolation, and that is a part of what we're having to deal with in these days. In these video talks, we've been thinking a bit about these seasons of self-isolation from a biblical perspective, and we've seen that both in the Old Testament with Moses and in the New Testament with Jesus, they both experience a period of voluntary self-isolation for 6 weeks. And we mentioned as well that throughout history the church has known the discipline of solitude and silence, where individuals have undertaken periods of self-isolation in their pursuit of God and in their desire to experience personal transformation as his disciples. And these experiences can be very foundational for us. They reveal what's underneath the topsoil of our lives and of the life of the church. And it's been so encouraging in these days to witness firsthand the sense of community that we've enjoyed as a church family, the sense of mutual support that's going on. And that's a very healthy sign. It is showing us that underneath the topsoil we have some healthy foundations, and so well done. Last time we began to consider the way that these experiences are not just foundational, but they're formational, and how solitude is a tool that though we're not very used to it in our busy, noisy, frantic, modern Western society, it is a key tool. It's a means of God's grace through which He shapes our lives in certain ways. And so our expectation is, as we take hold of this as a means of God's grace, that we will all emerge from this experience very, very different. I was encouraging us to really embrace what God's doing through this time, and not just simply press the pause button in life and try and ride out this season by immersing ourselves in things like social media, or cramming in as much Netflix as we can stomach. God is at work in us, and He's at work in us in a number of ways. We mentioned two last time, in the area of identity, where we have the opportunity to discover fresh things about who God is, but also discovering and growing in our understanding of our own identity. We're discovering truth about who we are, and also, along with identity, dependency. We have in these days an opportunity to experience a more acute sense of our vulnerability, and that's a good thing. We're experiencing need and dependency in a way perhaps that we're not used to. Well, I want to mention in this talk two more ways in which we have an opportunity to joyfully grow during this time of self-isolation. The first is in the area of prayer. The measure of our dependency, of course, is often the quality of our devotional lives. And prayer is the great barometer of our spiritual health. By that means, the church in the West has largely, of course, been quite sick spiritually. We've lived prayerless lives, and we've existed as prayerless congregations. And that's not just because we've been too busy to pray. It's the result of deeper issues of dependency and self-reliance. We've trusted in our own human effort and action. And if there's a problem, therefore, we're okay, we're in control, we can go to work, we can find a solution, we can redouble our human efforts, and we can produce results. Well, in these days and at this season, we are all on a crash course in learning perhaps we're not nearly as in control as we thought we were. In fact, most of us probably are feeling quite helpless. We can't even leave our homes, let alone contribute in some way to sorting out the crisis. We can feel very powerless. And when we feel powerless, of course, we feel hopeless. Well, in the midst of that, there's an opportunity for us to rediscover something that's been pretty neglected: prayer. And it may be through this time of self-isolation that we have therefore an opportunity to address our prayerlessness. It's been really encouraging to see the way that prayer is becoming more and more a frequent part of what's happening online as churches respond to this crisis. Until fairly recently as a church, we've been running over our life and our history an early morning prayer meeting on a weekly basis as a church. But the reality, of course, has been pretty poorly attended for a whole number of reasons. In the good old days when we started, we would have 3, maybe even 4 on a good morning. In recent years, of course, it's been less well attended than that. There's been less than 2. And in the past 2 weeks, during this time, it's good to see that we've been meeting most days to pray online for half an hour. And on those mornings, we've had 8 to 10 regularly joining us. This is a new thing. Next Thursday, on Maunday Thursday, we have an opportunity to join online with thousands of others across the globe to pray for an hour in the midst of this crisis. This is undoubtedly one of the things that God's doing. And that's what a fresh sense of our dependency leads to. Jesus said, when you pray, go into your room and shut the door behind you. Self-isolate and pray to your Father who sees what's done in secret. Well, there may well be a sense in these days that God is sending us to our room and closing the door behind us. Why? Well, in order that we might pray to our Father, who is there in the secret place, who is there behind every front door. In order that we might learn to pray. Seasons of isolation encourage us to do that. We become more acutely aware of our need and the needs of around us. And in the midst of this time, I think there is a call to prayer. Do you hear that call? Let me encourage you to respond. Now, for some of us, of course, we may find we have more opportunity to pray. Now, that's not the case for everyone. Your life may well have actually become much more busy in terms of homeschooling and work demands. But in time, I guess, most of us will find that there is more time and space in our lives to pray as we're restricted in terms of what we can do. And I would encourage you to ensure that one of the ways you are responding to this crisis and to the restrictions is to bring into your life prayer in a way that it's not been there before. As individuals, as families, with your children, as churches. There's a great resource online at prayercourse.org if you are new to this practice of prayer and want to grow in some of the basics of what it means to learn to pray. Part of the purpose then of this season, this formational time, may well be that we are developing new rhythms of devotion in our lives. And if we emerge from this season a bit poorer, or a lot poorer, but with deeper, more consistent prayer lives, then surely that itself is a good thing. And seasons of isolation are conducive to us developing that in our lives. The truth is, of course, that prayer is the most impactful thing we can be doing in these days. It's not just personal therapy that makes us feel better and cope better with the situation. Prayer works. Wayne Grudem says prayer changes the way God acts. That's his summary of what the Bible teaches about the powerful tool of prayer. And of course, we've trusted in inferior, less impactful resources by and large, human effort and ingenuity. And all along, we've neglected the resource of prayer, which is far more impactful. Well, here's a season for us to discover afresh the place of prayer. This is what Chrysostom said about the power of prayer. He said, "The potency of prayer has subdued the strength of fire. It has bridled the rage of lions, hushed anarchy to rest, extinguished wars, appeased the elements, expelled demons, burst the chains of death, expanded the gates of heaven, assuaged diseases, repelled frauds, rescued cities from destruction, stayed the sun in its course, and arrested the progress of the thunderbolt. Prayer is an all-sufficient panoply, a treasure undiminished, a mind that's never exhausted, a sky unobscured by clouds, a heaven unruffled by the storm. It is the root, the foundation, the mother of 1,000 blessings." Let's ensure that we're rediscovering this powerful, impactful activity of prayer and to develop fresh rhythms of devotion in our lives. And then one more thing that we're, I trust, changing in is in the whole area of rest. Some have spoken of this time as like that of an enforced Sabbath. The reality, of course, is that for some, this season actually is involving a lot more work, particularly those in roles of leadership, lots more meetings and decisions and adjustments within an extremely short space of time. And so for some, it's meant longer shifts and more pressure. For key workers, that's certainly the case. But for most, however, and I'm guessing increasingly this will be the case as the crisis impacts on our economy, it's meant time being away from work. If you've been furloughed, as you may well have been, you can't do the things you normally would. You can't monitor those email boxes or complete those tasks. There's been a very abrupt end to that work. Along with that, much of the noise and bustle of regular life around us has completely shut down. If you live in an urban area, that will be even more noticeable. There's been a fair bit of a commentary on some of the positive outcomes of this season of self-isolation and shutdown. Someone I know who lives right in the heart of London spoke of the relief of the quietness on the streets with no traffic, with shops closed, and they wondered if after this there might be a fresh push to return to that weekly Sunday shutdown that used to be the case, of course, in our nation before trading laws changed. The word Sabbath means stop. And if you know your Bible, you'll know that this is a major theme or principle in terms of how God intends us as humans and the world we're responsible for to function. God himself sets the precedent by resting from his activity, his work in creation on the seventh day. And then, of course, a weekly pattern of Sabbath is established and enshrined within the Ten Commandments. But there was also a Sabbath year for the land within the cycle of agriculture. After 6 years of cultivation, the fields would be left in the seventh year to go fallow, so that nutrients could be replenished within the soil. Along with that, there was the Jubilee. After 7 cycles of 7 years, the whole nation enjoyed a time when slaves were set free and debts were wiped out and land and property was returned to the original owners. And that was a very important principle, Sabbath, a time to stop. And in some senses, this is a time to stop. And I think one of the reasons why so many of us are in such a state of shock and are finding the restrictions so challenging is just because we've forgotten how to stop. It's like when you're in a car motoring along and the driver has to slam the brakes on. The tyres scream. Everyone in the car's thrown around and can end up traumatised. Well, we've become so used to perpetual movement and activity and work, that the demand for us to stop can feel like something of a trauma. Even when everything around us stops, somehow we can find internally the wheels are still spinning. Sabbath is as much an internal as well as an external issue. It's not just not going to work, it's not working. You can go to work or you can not go to work but still be working on the inside. The wheels can still be spinning. It's when we rest from work on the inside that we're experiencing Sabbath in our hearts, in our minds. And one of the ways perhaps that God's working in these days may well be to help us rediscover the value of Sabbath, learning how to stop. Well, my prayer is that we'll realise then that this is a foundational time for each of us, that we'll embrace and lay hold of all that God's doing in us during this time. Let's learn to pray. Let's build those rhythms into our lives. Let's have a renewed dependency that expresses itself in prayer as we discover afresh this powerful tool that God has given to us. And let's learn to stop. Let's learn the value of Sabbath, rest. Let's learn to value that very important principle, and let's practice it. Next time we're going to consider the ways in which these seasons of self-isolation can ultimately end up as being very fruit-bearing, fruitful seasons. So please join us.